On the morning of an execution day in Texas, a condemned prisoner may already be gone from his cell before most people even know a transfer is happening. No press release, no public schedule, no exact route. Only a tight circle of officials are told the details: wardens, top security leadership, and a few people with a strict need to know. Even within the prison system, most staff will never hear the full plan. Because in Texas, moving a death row prisoner is not treated like a normal transport. It's treated like a high-risk operation, built around secrecy, timing, and control. And the question is simple: why does Texas keep these transfers so quiet? What are they protecting, and from whom? This documentary explains the real, verified system behind Texas death row transfers and the quiet security operations that move condemned prisoners through one of America's most guarded prison networks. Everything in this story is based on documented procedures and publicly available facts, including Texas Department of Criminal Justice execution procedures and official death row information. We will examine where Texas death row prisoners are held, how and why transfers happen, what makes these movements unusually secretive, and what these operations reveal about the modern death penalty system. This is not entertainment. It's education, focused on policy, security structure, and real-world consequences. This documentary is for educational and informational purposes only. All content is based on factual, research-driven information from public records, official documents, court filings, and reporting by reputable media and human rights organizations. No information is intentionally fabricated or exaggerated. Before we proceed, please like, share, comment, and subscribe to support the channel. For decades, Texas has run the largest and most active modern execution system in the United States. But what many people don't realize is this: death row is not the same place as the execution chamber. Texas is structured like a divided system. Most male death row prisoners are housed at the Allan B. Polunsky Unit, near Livingston, Texas. Executions happen at the Huntsville Unit, where the state's execution chamber is located. That distance isn't an accident. It creates separation between long-term confinement and the final stage. And that separation forces one unavoidable step. Texas must physically move condemned prisoners across the state when an execution is scheduled. This is where transfers become more than transportation. Because to the state, a death row transfer is not simply moving a person. It's moving a person who might be desperate, mentally unstable, under extreme stress, and in the most controlled custody category possible. Texas procedures describe how, in the final week before an execution, a formal observation system begins, an execution watch log, tracking activity frequently and escalating in frequency as the day gets closer. Then, the key turning point arrives. In the official procedure, Texas states that the inmate is escorted to a holding setting at the death row unit. An official transport log begins, and crucially, any transportation arrangements for the inmate between units shall be known only to the wardens involved, the CID director, as well as those persons they designate as having a need to know. The policy goes even further: no public announcement, no exact time, no method, no route. That is not normal prison practice. That is counter-escape strategy. Because Texas is not just moving prisoners. It's moving prisoners whose names are already known by the public, sometimes by activists, reporters, and sometimes by people who have threatened violence in the past. Which raises the next question: if the system is this secretive, what has happened before that made Texas build transfers like a covert operation? And what are officials preparing for every single time a death row prisoner leaves Polunsky? That answer begins with what happened after Texas moved death row to Polunsky in 1999, and how quickly the unit became a security pressure cooker. In the late 1990s, Texas already had a death penalty system that was nationally known. But inside the prison agency, there was a different problem, one that most people never saw. Death row had become a security vulnerability. At the time, male death row prisoners were housed at the Ellis Unit, closer to Huntsville. But in November 1998, a condemned prisoner named Martin Gurley escaped from the Ellis Unit. He was found dead about a week later. For Texas prison leadership, that escape sent a message. If a condemned prisoner could get out once, the state had to assume it could happen again. And in Texas, the fear wasn't only escape. It was what a death row escape would represent: an emergency that could quickly become a national crisis. The move that changed everything. By 1999, Texas made a major decision. Male death row would be moved to a newer and more isolated facility, the Allan B. Polunsky Unit in Livingston. According to reporting and historical documentation, Texas officials also linked this crackdown to the 1998 escape attempt and security concerns. This was not a small relocation. It became the largest transfer of condemned prisoners in history, carried out under heavy security and lasting months. And with the transfer came a shift in philosophy. Texas did not just want death row controlled. Texas wanted death row predictable, because predictability is what allows security to work. The pressure inside Polunsky, but as soon as death row arrived at Polunsky, the unit became a pressure cooker. Not because of one person, but because of the environment itself. Extreme isolation, constant confinement, limited movement, and the unique stress of living with a death sentence. Within the first year of death row operating at Polunsky, serious incidents made headlines. In February 2000, 2 death row prisoners took a corrections officer hostage for nearly 13 hours before she was released. That hostage situation wasn't just a crime story. To prison leadership, it was a clear operational warning. Even under maximum security, condemned inmates could still create a crisis and force the entire prison system to react. Soon after, another high-profile incident reinforced the same fear, that small security failures could create major emergencies. How Texas responded. Control through secrecy. After these events, Texas didn't only harden doors and add procedures. It changed how information moved. Because in the prison world, information is a tool. If people know when a prisoner is being moved, what route is being used, which unit is receiving him, or what staff are assigned, then that knowledge can be exploited by other inmates, by outside contacts, or even by someone inside the system who shouldn't have access. So Texas adopted a rule that now sits quietly inside execution procedures. Transportation arrangements are known only to select wardens, the CID director, and people designated need to know. That single phrase, need to know, explains the entire operation. It's not just secrecy for secrecy's sake. It's the state admitting something uncomfortable. Moving a condemned prisoner is one of the most dangerous and unpredictable moments in the entire death penalty process. And this is where the story turns. Because if Texas is so strict about information, what happens when a prisoner finds a way to communicate anyway? In the next chapter, we examine a case that shook the system from the inside, when a death row inmate used a smuggled cell phone to make threats that led to a massive lockdown across Texas prisons. It proved that even the most controlled prison population can still reach the outside world. By the early 2000s, Texas had tightened death row security. Transfers were more controlled. Information was more restricted. Even staff movement was managed more carefully than before. But Texas prison leadership was learning something that correctional systems across America eventually had to accept. Maximum security does not mean maximum control. Because control depends on one thing above all else: communication. And in a prison environment, communication is power. The problem: Texas could not fully eliminate Texas death row prisoners were restricted heavily, especially at Polunsky. But restrictions can't eliminate ingenuity. Contraband has always existed inside prisons, but one type of contraband changed everything: cell phones. A cell phone can do what letters, visits, and monitored calls cannot: unmonitored contact, real-time planning, and direct access to the outside world. And for prison security, the danger isn't just escape planning. It's the possibility that an inmate can influence events outside prison walls, without staff even knowing it's happening. The incident that triggered an emergency response in 2008, Texas faced exactly that fear. A death row inmate at the Polunsky Unit, Robert Patton, was accused of using a smuggled cell phone to make threats against a state senator. Even worse, investigators believed he was using the phone to communicate beyond prison security, showing how modern contraband could turn one inmate into a public risk. Texas responded in a way that revealed how seriously it viewed the threat: a sweeping lockdown across multiple prison units. This was not routine discipline. A prison lockdown affects everything: staff schedules, movement for medical care, visitation, phone access, and operational stability. Lockdowns cost money. They also create tension and instability across entire facilities. So when a prison system locks down units over one contraband phone, the message is clear. The system is willing to shut down normal operations to prevent information leaking out. Why this matters for death row transfers? This case matters because it shows why Texas keeps transfers secret. If a condemned inmate knows the exact time they will be moved, which staff will be present, or which unit is receiving them, that information can travel fast. It can be shared with other inmates, outside contacts, or even broadcast publicly. And when transfers connect to executions, the stakes become even higher. Texas doesn't just fear disruption. It fears a scenario where outsiders attempt to interfere with a transfer, staff become targets, or a prisoner uses the transfer moment to trigger a crisis. That's why transfer planning is locked behind need to know. Texas is not only moving bodies. Texas is protecting the chain of control. A system forced to adapt after high-profile incidents like these, prison agencies across the U.S. invested in tools to detect contraband phones, especially at high-security facilities. But contraband enforcement is never perfect, and Texas knew it, which is why secrecy remained essential. Not just secrecy from the public, secrecy from inmates, secrecy from other prison staff who aren't involved, secrecy from anyone who might unintentionally leak details. The new reality, transfers as high-risk moments. When Texas plans a death row transfer today, especially near execution dates, it's treated like a moment where the system could lose control if anything goes wrong. And death row transfers are not only about the condemned prisoner. They are about protecting staff, preventing hostage or disturbance attempts, protecting the public, and ensuring the state can carry out the legal process without disruption. But here's where the story sharpens again. Because secrecy alone does not guarantee safety. And Texas learned that not from contraband phones, but from one of the most serious threats prison systems fear: planned violence during prisoner movement. In the next chapter, we look at why prisoner transport is considered one of the most dangerous correctional operations in America and how death row transfers are structured to reduce risk step by step. The question becomes, what does an execution transfer actually look like when everything is designed to prevent a single failure? For most people, death row sounds like a single place, one building where everything happens. In Texas, it isn't. Death row is long-term confinement at Polunsky, but the execution chamber is in Huntsville. So when the courts schedule an execution, Texas has a logistical problem. The state must move a person who has nothing left to lose. That single fact shapes everything. Because for correctional planners, it creates three risks: escape attempts, self-harm, or medical crisis, disruptions that could endanger staff or delay the legal process. So Texas built an execution transfer process that reads more like a security operation than a typical transport. The official execution watch begins according to Texas Department of Criminal Justice procedures. The process begins days before the execution date. Texas uses an execution watch, a monitoring system where staff track the inmate regularly and log activity. The point is not punishment. It's risk management. Because an inmate who is facing death may experience extreme anxiety, sudden changes in behavior, withdrawal, or unpredictable decisions. The system monitors these shifts closely because any crisis right before transfer can derail the process. Isolation as control. As the execution date approaches, Texas procedures describe controlled movement and an isolation-based routine, reduced contact, structured property handling, and a formal record of the inmate's status and movement. Again, this isn't random. Transfers are vulnerable moments. In prison history, transports have been exploited through distractions, staged emergencies, contraband weapon use, or coordinated incidents timed with movement. So Texas limits what can be carried, what can be accessed, and what can be anticipated. Need to know isn't a slogan. It's a security barrier. Here's where Texas differs from what many people imagine. In the execution procedure, Texas is explicit. Transportation arrangements are known only to select wardens, the CID director, and those designated with a need to know. That means, in practice, not everyone at the sending unit knows the route. Not everyone at the receiving unit knows exact arrival time, and most people who work in corrections won't see the full plan. This reduces the chance of leaks, targeted interference, or manipulation by inmates who gather information. The transfer itself, controlled movement, Layered custody Texas does not describe public details like routes or exact staffing numbers in the procedure because secrecy is part of the design. But the structure is clear: secure escort, documented custody chain, and tight control from departure to arrival. In prison operations, this is called maintaining the chain of custody. It means there is no ambiguous moment where responsibility can be blurred. Every stage is documented because one mistake could create legal and operational fallout. Arrival in Huntsville. The death house. Once transferred to Huntsville, the inmate is no longer simply on death row. He is now inside the last phase of the process, held near the execution chamber, often referred to historically and publicly as the death house area of the Huntsville Unit. This is where control becomes even more intense, because now timing matters. Texas must coordinate legal contacts, potential stays, media protocols, witnesses, spiritual support arrangements, and security, all while preventing disorder, inside or outside the unit. The final risk: disruption outside prison walls. Execution days bring crowds. Some gather to protest. Some gather to support the execution. Some are families of victims. Some are advocates for the condemned. In a democracy, those gatherings are lawful. But for corrections leadership, they create unpredictability. The system must prevent disturbances at gates and access points, threats to staff, or disruptions that could delay movement. So secrecy becomes a public safety tool too. If no one knows the exact time of movement, no one can plan around it. Turning point at this stage, Texas has one goal: carry out the sentence without losing control of the institution. But the closer the execution gets, the more one uncomfortable truth becomes visible. Even perfect procedures cannot remove the human element. Because death row transfers don't only test locks and vehicles. They test the psychology of everyone involved. The condemned inmate, officers assigned to the movement, leadership making decisions under legal pressure, and the broader prison culture shaped by repeated execution cycles. In the next chapter, we look at the part of the system almost never described publicly: what these transfers do to staff, and why prison agencies treat execution teams as a protected workforce. Because the secrecy isn't just about the inmate. Sometimes it's about protecting the people who work the operation. When the public talks about the death penalty, attention usually goes to two places: the crime and the execution. But inside the prison system, another reality exists, one that is rarely discussed in detail: the staff. Because in Texas, death row transfers and execution logistics are not handled by whoever is on shift. They involve selected personnel, controlled access, and layered responsibility. Not to create mystery, but because these operations have a known effect on the people required to do them. Why transfers are assigned differently. Execution-related transport is treated as a special category of movement. Not because of the distance between Polunsky and Huntsville, but because the state is moving a prisoner under the highest emotional pressure possible and doing it under legal deadlines. That creates stress on both sides of the escort. For staff, the risks include unpredictable inmate behavior during movement, media pressure and public attention, activists and crowds around Huntsville on execution day, and the possibility of someone attempting interference or retaliation. Even when those threats are low probability, they are high impact. So Texas builds these operations around controlled exposure, controlled information, controlled staff assignment, controlled access to schedules. The system is designed to limit who becomes a public target. Privacy is part of the operation. One detail most viewers don't realize: in death penalty systems, staff identities can become a security issue. In some states, execution team members and certain staff roles are protected from public identification, partly due to harassment concerns and personal safety. Texas execution procedures emphasize confidentiality and need-to-know planning, meaning fewer people have access to specifics of timing and movement. This is why many details of transfers are not public, not because they are illegal, but because officials treat them like a public safety issue, a prison security issue, and a staff protection issue. A job built on emotional control. Corrections work is often described in physical terms: keys, doors, searches, restraints. But in maximum security units, a large part of the job is psychological. Officers are trained to stay calm, avoid escalation, and never lose emotional control in tense environments. Execution transfers intensify this. The inmate knows the outcome. Officers know the outcome. There is no uncertainty. That creates a strange environment where emotions are high, but behavior must remain disciplined and procedural. This is one reason systems rely on repetition and routine. Checklists, logs, confirmation steps, controlled movement. Structure prevents error, but it also protects staff from carrying the entire weight of the moment emotionally. The hidden danger, institutional strain, in many prison systems, repeated execution cycles create what researchers and corrections professionals often describe as occupational stress, including burnout, emotional fatigue, and moral conflict. Even among experienced officers, this can appear as sleep disruption, increased irritability, emotional numbness, or distancing from family life. And because prison culture often emphasizes toughness, staff may not seek support. This matters for transfers because an execution transfer is not only about the inmate's behavior. It's also about officers maintaining discipline under pressure. A small lapse in concentration, one missed step, can cause injury, escape opportunity, or a procedural mistake that becomes a legal issue. So the system focuses heavily on preventing errors caused by stress. Why the system becomes more secretive over time as Texas carried out more executions over decades. Operational experience created one key lesson. The less attention drawn to movement details, the safer the operation becomes. Because attention can create crowds at the wrong place, rumors and misinformation, heightened emotions around the transfer, and risks to staff. So, secrecy is not just about hiding. It is about limiting volatility. Turning point by this point, Texas death row transfers are built around a core principle: reduce unpredictability, reduce risk. But unpredictability remains, because the most unstable variable is not always the prisoner. It can be the wider system. Court decisions can change at the last minute. Emergency motions can be filed hours before an execution. A governor, a court, or federal intervention can instantly pause the process. And when that happens, Texas must be ready to reverse everything. In the next chapter, we examine a tense and often confusing reality. What happens when an execution is delayed or stopped at the last moment, and how that affects transfers, lockdowns, and inmate management. Because in the final hours, the system may shift suddenly, and everyone involved must adapt in real time. Texas death row transfers are built on routine, but the death penalty system itself is not routine. Because even when a prisoner has been moved, monitored, and prepared for execution day, one thing can still disrupt everything: the courts. The unstable final hours in capital punishment. The final phase often involves rapid legal activity, emergency filings, appeals, requests for stays, new evidence claims, procedural challenges. These can happen days before an execution or hours before. And when they succeed, even temporarily, the prison system must pivot immediately. This is not only a legal issue, it is a security issue, because Texas has already activated heightened staffing, special monitoring, restricted movement procedures, and controlled information protocols. If the execution is stopped, the system has to decide quickly: does the prisoner remain at Huntsville, or is he returned to death row at Polunsky? And that decision triggers another high-security transfer, often with little notice. Why reversal transfers are difficult from the outside? It seems simple. If the execution is postponed, just take him back. Inside the correctional system, it is not simple at all, because a last-minute delay can change inmate behavior. The prisoner may swing between emotional collapse, anger, relief, or numbness. That emotional instability can create the exact conditions correctional planners fear: unpredictability during movement. So Texas procedures continue monitoring and documentation during the last stage of the process. Even the act of returning someone to death row must be controlled, because a reverse transfer still carries the same risks: escape attempt during transport, self-harm risk, or destabilizing incidents in custody. The public almost never sees this part. What makes this chapter of the system so important is that it's rarely visible. When an execution is delayed, news coverage often focuses on the court ruling, attorney statements, and reactions from families. But behind the scenes, Texas may be dealing with lockdown measures, staff redeployment, transport readiness, and the problem of secrecy. Because even if the public hears that a stay was issued, The public does not automatically know where the prisoner is now, what unit he's being held in, or whether he's being moved again. And Texas often prefers it that way. Secrecy prevents crowds from repositioning, rumors from shaping staff safety risks, and the prisoner from predicting what comes next. What delays reveal about capital punishment? Delays reveal a central contradiction in the death penalty system. On one hand, the state attempts to make executions procedural and controlled. On the other hand, legal safeguards exist precisely because executions are irreversible. So the process becomes a conflict between certainty, security, and logistics, and uncertainty, legal oversight, and last-minute review. For prison leadership, this uncertainty is a nightmare. Because an execution schedule means aligning staff rosters, witness logistics, security perimeters, controlled movement, and medical procedure readiness. If the execution doesn't happen, the system still absorbs the cost and strain. Turning point at this point, we understand the visible structure. Death row at Polunsky, execution chamber at Huntsville, secret transfers between them. But one major question remains unanswered. If the system is so controlled, why is the pressure so intense? And the answer lies in the environment itself. Because the true engine behind these operations is not only security, it's long-term isolation and what it does to human behavior over years and decades. In the next chapter, we examine the hidden factors shaping everything Texas does on death row, the psychological impact of confinement, and why death row management is less about punishment than containment. By the time a condemned prisoner is transferred for execution, the state has already managed him for years, sometimes decades. And Texas has learned something that shapes every decision on death row. The longer someone is confined under extreme restriction, the more unpredictable behavior can become. That doesn't mean every prisoner becomes violent, but it does mean the prison system can't rely on normal routines. Death row is designed for containment, not rehabilitation across Texas units. Most prison systems are built around movement. Work programs, education, structured time outside cells, and controlled interaction. Death row is different. Its purpose is not preparation for release. Its purpose is secure containment until the legal process ends. That mission affects everything: the housing model, the staffing mindset, and especially the rules surrounding transfers. For Texas, the transfer itself becomes a pressure point, because it is one of the few moments when a long-confined prisoner moves through spaces that must remain stable and predictable. A system built to prevent chain reactions, Texas doesn't only fear what a single inmate might do. It fears what a single event might trigger. Inside prisons, instability spreads quickly. Lockdowns change routines, stress rises among inmates, staff fatigue increases, and small incidents can escalate. That's why execution-related movements are treated with extreme caution. Texas is protecting not just one vehicle, not just one inmate. It's protecting the entire institution from a chain reaction. And that explains why death row transfers remain a quiet operation. Strict planning, minimal public detail, need-to-know communication, and controlled timing. The final transfer is the last stage of state power when Texas moves a condemned prisoner from Polunsky to Huntsville. It is more than transport. It is the final physical step in a process involving trial courts, appeals courts, state and federal review, victims' families, defense teams, and correctional leadership. By the time that movement happens, the state is no longer debating guilt or innocence inside the prison system. The prison system's mission becomes narrower and more unforgiving. Carry out the sentence safely, lawfully, and without chaos. That is why secrecy matters. Because in Texas, the most guarded system isn't just the execution chamber. It's everything that leads to it. The routes, the schedules, the staffing, the transfer logs, the chain of control, and almost all of it stays hidden. Not because it's dramatic, but because it's operational. And in corrections, operations are survival. Texas death row transfers reveal a side of the justice system most people never see. Not the courtroom debates, not the headlines, but the quiet machinery behind the scenes, where the state treats information like security and movement like risk. These transfers exist because Texas built a death penalty system that is geographically separated. Death row at Polunsky, executions at Huntsville, and the state must move condemned prisoners through that system without losing control of the prison environment or putting staff and the public at risk. Whether someone supports or opposes capital punishment, this is the reality. Once a death sentence is imposed, the state must manage the process to its final moment. And in Texas, that final management is built around one principle: security through secrecy. If you found this documentary useful, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment with what part of the Texas death row system surprised you most.